The largest air battle of the jet age was a rout. On June 9, 1982, Israeli fighter jets destroyed at least 82 Syrian fighter jets. The Israeli Air Force lost a single aircraft in the battle, even though it was fought over hostile territory, namely eastern Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. The Israeli Air Force destroyed all of Syria's 19 anti-aircraft batteries in the area. The Syrians had fought with Soviet aircraft and kit. The Israelis fought with what David Ivry, head of Israel's Air Force at the time, later told me was, quote, a concert of Western military technology. One result of the historic battle, Operation Mole Cricket 19, was that enemies of Israel mostly gave up efforts to fight the Israel Defense Forces head-on. Instead, they've since focused on killing civilians. But that's another story. Another result of the historic battle was that the Soviet leadership realized that the Soviet system was not producing the technological innovation needed to match Western military prowess. This played a role in Mikhail Gorbachev's subsequent reforms for glasnost, political openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring, both of which ultimately proved to be too little, too late. But that too is another story. For our purposes today, let's focus on another aspect of Israel's victory. That aspect casts light on an important dynamic between culture, innovation, and military success. And I define military success to include maintaining a defensive posture that prevents an aggressor from attacking in the first place. Because Western soldiers are accustomed to greater personal freedom than are soldiers from authoritarian or theocratic societies, Westerners tend to be more innovative. They also tend to be better problem solvers imbued with a spirit of entrepreneurial spunk. This means that Western fighters have traditionally been better at rapidly changing tactics to seize unexpected and fleeting opportunities in combat. In short, Western cultures have broadly encouraged individual initiative. This is a cultural forte. Consider that cultures that put less value on individual initiative, or which discourage individual initiative, be it through political control or social disapproval, tend to produce fewer inventors. Those cultures also produce fewer ideas that turn into big wealth-generating companies. During the 1982 air battle, the Syrian pilots were neither permitted nor mentally prepared to deviate from rigid Soviet dogfighting doctrine. Because the Israeli pilots had also studied Soviet dogfighting doctrine, it was easier for them to anticipate Syrian maneuvers. And because the Israelis had been allowed to innovate new techniques and to modify them on the fly, as it were, the pilots were better able to change tactics as they saw what was working and what was not working. During the air battle, Israeli pilots were also radioed more tactical intelligence on what was going on than the Syrian pilots were. Of course, this cultural edge is intangible, but that doesn't make it less real. In fact, the developers of much of the software that defense planners use to forecast the outcome of a possible battle or campaign takes this cultural factor into account in the form of an algorithmic force multiplier or divider. One such piece of software, the Tactical Numerical Deterministic Model, which is made by the Dupuy Institute and sold to defense ministries for about $120,000, refers to this intangible as initiative. It's the extent to which lower-ranking soldiers are able to improvise on the battlefield, both the cultural reflexes that they have and the permission to act on those reflexes. In an interview, Tom Watt, a major general in the British Army, who leads the Defense Ministry's efforts to simulate and forecast combat outcomes, put it to me concisely, albeit with a touch of hyperbole. It's people who win wars, not equipment, he said. Today, I will point out a few ways that America and its Western allies can make the most of this cultural advantage. Following those points, I will also argue that there are a number of reasons, very diverse reasons, to be concerned about the West's ability to sustain its lead in innovation. This is troubling stuff. There is currently no shortage of challenger powers intent on weakening the West. Robert Kagan, a geopolitical thinker, refers to these efforts by regimes in China, Russia, Iran, and elsewhere as, quote, the jungle grows back. The West's strength has always relied on its economic and cultural dynamism. Innovation is the heart of that. If innovation in the West were to meaningfully weaken, it would become much harder for the West to slow the current erosion of the rules-based international order. First, though, before we look at ways in which the West's edge in innovation appears to be slipping, let's look at a few ways Western militaries can better leverage the human capital of their warfighters. First, since Western soldiers typically have more leeway to interpret the commander's intent, they're also typically able to squeeze more value out of tactical intelligence than our non-Western soldiers who may not have the permission or the cultural reflexes to improvise on a battle plan that is proceeding poorly. Western soldiers should therefore be asked what new types of tactical intelligence would help them. Think creatively. For example, if a patrol can be told that agricultural runoff from a certain rainstorm has probably polluted a certain village water well, those soldiers will likely find a warmer welcome from that village's elders. Second, develop better automated systems to collect and process tactical intelligence. David Shedd, a former acting director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, told me that the United States must craft algorithms to determine which bits of intel should be automatically pushed out to soldiers in the field. This AI must be designed intelligently so that soldiers are not flooded with superfluous information. Third, develop better display systems for the beaming of tactical intelligence to soldiers. The idea, what you want essentially, is to be able to display intel without soldiers needing to take their eyes off the world around them. This can be done in various ways. Augmented reality headsets, virtual retina displays, also known as retina projectors, can be used. These use essentially a headset-mounted laser to scan imagery directly onto the retina. In fact, in an interview with James Gertz, who was then head of procurement for the U.S. Special Operations Command, he referred to this to me as, quote, meaningfully tactically relevant information at the point of need. That, he told me, is, quote, the holy grail. Another approach being developed by a firm called Avigant uses silicon chips with tiny hinged mirrors that flip back and forth to reflect multicolored LED light onto the retina. Beyond that, defense chiefs must also refine mission command so that troops have enough decision-making autonomy to benefit from their creativity, of course, within the framework of following commander's intent. These efforts will make it easier for Western forces to outcycle an enemy's decision-making loop, especially considering the fact that many non-Western soldiers are more likely to be encumbered with the delays inherent in communicating with superiors who are elsewhere. Now let's pivot to look at causes for concern, the mechanisms through which the West's historical advantage in innovation appear to be weakening. For starters, the West's edge in freedom and the innovation to which this freedom gives rise can also be a liability that an adversary can exploit. Not long ago, I interviewed Sorin Dukaru, a former NATO boss for emerging threats. He told me that the smartphones that nearly all Western soldiers own have become a, quote, soft belly of the military alliance. Ambassador Dukuru was talking to me about the fact that Russians are now investing heavily in capabilities for spying on the personal smartphones of NATO troops, not to mention those of Ukrainian soldiers. Some of the eavesdropping is carried out with devices the size of a briefcase that are called IMSI catchers. Now that stands for International Mobile Subscriber Identity Catcher. These devices act like a cell tower and trick nearby mobile phones into exchanging data. The sting is not revealed to the handset or to the telecom operating the network. As Linas Idzelis, head of information operations at Lithuania's defense ministry in Vilnius, told me, a hostile agent parked outside with the kit could compile a list of officials' phone numbers. Now, of course, NATO soldiers are certainly not supposed to be using personal phones for military communications. However, the culture of greater openness and freedom in the West means that personal smartphones of Western soldiers do hold and transmit information that can be useful to an adversary. And whereas Russian commanders have been able to put in place strict restrictions on soldiers' use of mobiles in eastern Ukraine, Western defense chiefs fear, and probably correctly so, that were they to put in place a blanket ban on smartphone ownership, morale would take quite a hit. Consider an American soldier who posts a profile on a dating app. That soldier exposes himself to blackmail or intimidation. This vulnerability is especially problematic when it comes to adversaries willing to engage in what a European defense attaché recently described to me as dirty warfare. He was referring to Kremlin proxy forces in eastern Ukraine who have hacked into the phones of Ukrainian soldiers and then contacted those soldiers' parents to claim falsely that their son had been taken prisoner and would be freed for a monetary ransom. Because they can get photos off the supposed prisoner's phone, these photos facilitate the demoralizing scam. Another source, a NATO colonel, described to me an intimidation campaign in which the families of NATO soldiers stationed in the Baltic states are telephoned by strangers, speaking with a Russian accent, who curiously know personal details about the family's loved one. In short, the more autonomy you give soldiers, the more information they have about operations, and the easier it is for an adversary to get its hands on compromising information. A more fundamental shift is that the leadership of Russia's armed forces is now well aware of their soldiers' cultural disadvantage. I'm told by sources that the Russian leadership's awareness of this cultural disadvantage became painfully clear following the relatively poor performance of Russian troops that invaded Georgia in 2008. Russia, I'm told, is now working hard to remedy this shortcoming. NATO officials at the enhanced forward present, quote, tripwire base at Rukla in Lithuania told me that Russian soldiers have become, quote, better adversaries. Russia's attempt to compensate for this shortcoming is reflected in a few things. For one, we see greater emphasis on smaller units operating with more autonomy than in the old Soviet days, when commanders often thought in terms of division command. It also includes supply chain reforms in which lower ranking officers are gaining greater control of what they receive and when they get it. Russian forces are essentially decentralizing to adapt to a more complex, dynamic battle space. Now, of course, it's important to note that Russia's cultural organizational shift isn't likely, at least anytime soon, to produce Russian soldiers with the same mental preparedness of Western soldiers. For one thing, the Kremlin, and for that matter, other autocrat-led regimes, are not about to free the press in order to cultivate a population and therefore soldiers with greater skill in critical thinking. That said, there are a number of additional ways And again, these are of a diverse nature in which the West's edge in innovation appears to be eroding. For one thing, it's not just the smartphones of Western soldiers that are the subject of intense hacking efforts. Western businesses, and especially firms involved in design, engineer, and defense contracts, are the subject of cyber theft, especially by Chinese hackers. Last month, on July 7th, FBI Director Christopher Wray, speaking at the Hudson Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C., said that the Chinese Communist Party's, quote, expansive approach to stealing American intellectual property is part of one of the greatest transfers of wealth in human history. He said, and I quote, China has a fundamentally different system than ours and is doing all it can to exploit our openness while taking advantage of its own closed system. He added that the theft poses the greatest long-term threat to U.S. economic and national security. This theft appears to have accelerated now that so many technologists, entrepreneurs, and experts of all stripes are working from home on computers that are not behind a corporate firewall. The FBI director noted that China is also illicitly obtaining information by paying company insiders to secretly pass along information. China also has a policy of requiring many Western businesses to sign up for technology sharing partnerships in exchange for access to China's market. China's effort to close the gap on Western know-how informs Chinese policy at the highest levels. Chinese technology companies are required by law to share information with the Communist Party. And of course, much of the West's innovation takes place at universities. Foreign students are a big part of student bodies. And let's keep in mind that lots of university research is openly published. Publishing, in fact, is how academics get promoted. Beyond that, the fruits of Western innovation also end up in myriad consumer products that can be purchased anywhere and reverse engineered. Many of these technologies have military uses. Componentry in smartphones can be repurposed for use in drones and missile guidance systems, for example. The laser that Boeing put in one anti-mortar system for the US Army is a commercial, off-the-shelf product. Let me also point to the forces that are putting brakes on globalization. Some, in fact, now refer to this phenomenon as slowballization. Of course, the pandemic is playing a big role. But beyond that, we see various nationalist and populist movements that are pointing to the unequal gains of globalization and which are pushing harder for greater restrictions on the movement of merchandise and people. This too serves as a brake on innovation. Good ideas often come from mixing, combining, and tweaking various ways of thinking about a given matter. Think of it as cross-pollination. Well, this is not good news. It is a broad force affecting not just the West, but also much of the rest of the world. In emerging markets, for example, the International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook estimates that in recent years, foreign knowledge accounted for about 0.7 percentage points of annual growth in labor productivity. To get back to the matter specifically in Western countries, let me now turn to some less obvious forces that I believe are chipping away at the West's traditional edge. And first, let me note that though I write for The Economist, my thinking on these matters is independent of that publication. For the bulk of the second half of the 20th century, the West's historic struggle against communism provided the West with an important strategic goal. The free world needed to prevail over state systems that were bent on crushing individuals, not to mention their entrepreneurial and innovative sparks. When the Cold War came to a close 3 decades ago, many people in the West wrongly figured that the quote, end of history had arrived and that the free world could take its freedom more or less for granted. After all, at the time, it appeared that the Western model of market economies and liberal democracies would be broadly emulated. This led to what I call a strategic void in the West. The existential threat to the West had supposedly disappeared. And with that disappearance, energy that had previously gone into defeating Nazi Germany, energy that had gone into defeating Imperial Japan, energy that had gone into holding the line against totalitarian and communist regimes ended up being moved to other uses. Notably, much of that energy seems to have been redirected into a cultural ethos of bureaucratic, legislative, and societal tinkering. In short, a focus on tons of incremental tweaks in an attempt to create a perfect society. Now, of course, many of these efforts to fine-tune socio-political culture are well-intentioned. The problem is that the cumulative effect has been a thicket of obstacles that hinder innovation, experimentation, and risk-taking. These obstacles are not just bureaucratic and legislative. They now include a growing morass of new social strictures. These include what some might consider a growing hysteria of public shaming and fake virtue signaling disseminated and fueled by social media. Examples abound. Consider a recent petition to have a University of Pennsylvania professor fired for saying that the publishing industry is actually not systemically racist and should not be equated with police missteps. To many observers, it would appear that the Robespierres of the Twitter sphere seem more interested in reputation lynchings of people who say support freedom in one's choice of a Halloween costume than they are in reports of wholesale abuses of human rights in places like Libya, China, and Iran. This sort of cancel culture hobbles innovation. Innovation needs free speech. Efforts to use public shaming to enforce absolute conformity with politically correct doctrine hobble experimentation and risk-taking. Consider the plethora of petitions circulating among Silicon Valley employees that seek to prevent their tech employers, Google included, from taking on defense contracts. Another threat to the West's culture of innovation is the curious notion, which is gaining steam among some on the left, that people who have succeeded financially are, almost by definition, evildoers. This sort of thinking is inherently hostile to innovation. Now, let's consider a related political fashion. Calls for greater equality of opportunity, which are, of course, a good thing, have of late increasingly degenerated. They've degenerated into calls for equality of outcome. Now, equality of opportunity is dramatically different than equality of outcome. Demanding an equality of outcome is essentially akin to throttling the human ambition to strive. After all, what is striving? Striving is essentially an effort to get ahead, an effort to improve one's lot in life, an effort to stand out through achievement. Therefore, personal achievement is incompatible with equality of outcome. Now, the West has historically succeeded precisely because it encouraged innovation. Western societies did this by putting in place economic, political, and social systems that allowed innovators to benefit financially and also reputationally from their creations. For innovation to flourish in the West, this culture must not be crushed. Now, before we close, allow me to step back for a moment. Let's take a look at the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Of course, Rome was eventually overrun for many reasons. I will mention two. First, As corruption spread, overtaxed and underserviced citizens lost faith in the political system. Second, as the Dutch-Israeli military historian Martin van Creveld explained to me, the declining Roman Empire put more effort into engineering better catapults than it did into actually fighting the hordes of Alaric and other barbarians. In von Creveld's view, the Roman elite put more faith in technological supremacy than it did in nourishing the empire's will, than it did in nourishing the will of the people to defend its civilization. Von Creveld draws a parallel between then and today. The development of technologically exquisite defense systems, he says, cannot replace weak political will. More than a few observers detect a flagging will in the West to stand up against tyranny abroad, be it the initially sluggish Western response to Islamic State, or the tepid reaction to the internment and forced labor of Uyghurs in northwestern China. The West needs continued, robust innovation. But that innovation alone cannot substitute for a lack of will. In June of 2014, about 800 Islamic State fighters overran Mosul, even though that big city in northern Iraq held about 30,000 government troops. Most of the troops simply fled. As Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, a brilliant political scientist at New York University and a consultant to the CIA and Pentagon, told me, the will to fight is so important. About 40% of wars are won by the initially weaker side. Richard Davis, the head of Artis International, a think tank that studies the will to fight of societies, militaries, and irregular combatants for the Department of Defense and other clients, told me that some of their studies suggest that the will to defend democracy in the Western world has never been lower. The splintering of societal energies in the West, which I referred to a few minutes ago as a slouching into a sort of perfectionist tinkering, has fueled myriad campaigns for things like animal rights and, say, banning plastic bags. Whatever the merits of these causes, they are unlikely to focus the energies of the West on building a world order that supports the sanctity of the individual in the face of forces that seek to crush individuals to concentrate power in the hands of a regime or religious authorities. In short, be innovative, but do not neglect the underlying culture from which innovation springs. Thank you.